If we can go into the issue of leadership that you've also raised in a number of articles, more specifically, you've spoken about 5 dimensions or aspects of leadership that need to be in Malaysia that need to be tackled. So one of those aspects is, for example, the need to create and promote synergies for state-federal development and nation building. I want to focus on the state-federal development thing. So one of my questions is, okay, since 2008 when the government of Penang changed hands, we've seen how Penang Institute itself has to negotiate the politics of state-federal relations. That was 2008. Is it correct to say that times are changing and that the relations between state bodies and federal agencies are on the mend? That's one. What other issues do you serve as challenges if we are to create and promote synergies for state-federal development and nation building?
It's a difficult question. I mean, there are many aspects to answer, really. Well, back to what I said earlier, that our federalism was to incorporate what were obviously huge diversities between different parts, right? And so we had a federal system. And to make it even more complex, I would say that the Federation of Malaya that came into being, the agreement from 1948, that was not so much a federation of Malaya as a federation of sultans, right? Because they had to they couldn't deny the sultans anymore, although they did try. That's what the Malayan Union was, right? So the Malay upper class reacted. That's another thing I would like to take up, if I may put it in. The lack of proper class analysis in Malaysian political science, I think it hampers us a lot. And historically one can see why that became so, because during the 50s we were fighting the communists and so on, right? The British anyway, and those who wanted independence in a certain manner. And so if you were discussing left and right, you're probably leftist. So, you better not do it. And so that was one reason you did not want social scientists in government and so on and so forth, even in Singapore, right? Because social scientists they're probably sociologists and socio-anthropologists and whatnot, and they're going to think up all sorts of possibilities that we don't want even to think about.
That's why they're still clamping down on books.
class analysis are dangerous to a country like this. But that means that you're blind in one eye. So we are blind in one eye, and that's how we are, right? So that would connect to what you're asking me about why we are a federation in the first place. If I take now to go into more controversial matters, if I take Penang and I compare it to Hong Kong, not Singapore. People usually compare Hong Kong, Penang and Singapore. I would compare now, in certain contexts, Penang to Hong Kong. Now, the way the British built up their pearl of pots, they took Penang, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, or whatever. And now they've pulled back. And history happens slowly. It happens. If you're born at the wrong time, your whole life will be just about a certain retreating power or expanding power, or you're born right in the middle of the Second World War. Sorry, But these processes take longer than your whole life. They take longer than your whole life. Where was I? I was disturbed by that. Sorry. No, in Penang and Singapore then. So Penang was developed sort of separate from the mainland, right? And that's why we have problems now with Seberang Perai somehow being different from here and so on. And then you have Hong Kong, right? Now, when the Malayan Union started, Penang was put together with all the other states. Singapore was kept out. That was the end of the Strait Settlements. So the Strait Settlements was cut into two, and one part was put back, the other part was kept as a crown colony. At the sociological level, societal level, it was a shock, I'm sure, for many Penang people. We don't talk much about that. There are not many books written about that, but one can imagine that happening, because it was done from on high. You know?
Yes.
And then suddenly it's a new world you woke up in.
Yes.
Right. Now you had to adapt and be part of a bigger polity that you had a great distance to once. And many couldn't take it. They would leave for that reason, or they have to reorientate themselves in the global economy and so on and so forth. And they might move, or they learn to adapt and so on and so forth. That happened in the 50s, 60s. In Hong Kong, it's happening now. Same sort of reaction at the social level, where the Hong Kong person, I think the difference there has been played up by the Americans and so on. But there, at the bottom of it, why it could be played up, at the bottom of it, you had something similar to what must have happened at a smaller scale in Penang, where a different society, different culture, with a different orientation in the world, different values in how they were to grow in the world economy or participate in the economy, they were suddenly, many of their lines and channels were cut. And so they had to reorientate themselves. So they would leave, they would go to Vancouver, Perth, wherever. At a much bigger scale, and it's happening in our time, so we are seeing that. But if you compare that to Penang, you could see that these are just long-term effects of British withdrawal from their widespread colonial system. They created cultures and economies that were now defunct, right? So that's the case of Penang. And then you have Sabah and Sarawak, and then you have Kelantan. What's Kelantan's role in the national economy? Very little. Whatever oil they have in Terengganu will go to the center. So it's all for a centralizing understanding of nation building. Where lies the federalism? The federalism would be in things like you can employ your own civil servants, and but largely they obey the center. And so whatever is taught up at the center is not going to be necessarily equipped to help the periphery. For example, in the 60s, when the center, Kuala Lumpur, took away the free port status, it just decimated the Penang economy. Now, one could argue from the center that, well, we're nation building, what can we do? We have to centralize the economy, everything has to be controlled from us. So Penang became extremely peripheral. One has to think that before independence, Penang was quite a hub, economic hub, for Medan, for Phuket, for Taiping, for Perak, so on. It has its own little world. But once you became Malaya, you were peripheral, and the economics followed. Now, luckily, we went for the electronics industry and so on, and that saved Penang. But culturally, it turned Penang's population from being a port of traders and port dwellers into factory workers and tourist guides. You see what happened. So the essence of the different parts were ignored, because you have this idea of things has to be centralized, everything has to be centralized. And the worst of it in the Malaysian case, then when you have this centralizing tendency, you think culture should be centralized. The point of federalism is that your cultural differences are too great to be centralized. But if your idea of nation building, not country building, we should actually, in Malaysia's case, talk about federation building. And that, if I meet Anwar Ibrahim today, I would tell him, think federation building. Then your budget would look different. And then whatever different states manage to accomplish economically and so on, that's to Malaysia's honor, no? Why should Malaysia's honor only come from the Klang Valley? How stupid is that,
Mm.
right? So the nature of Malaysia, the country Malaysia, is federalistic.
Mm.
And the longer you deny it, the more you keep fighting yourself and other countries who have gotten their act together because they've changed their conceptual
Yeah.
framework to modernize it.
Yeah.
They've modernized it. They're going to move faster than you.
I was thinking of like the idea of having an anchor culture. Instead of having like an anchor tenant, there's an anchor culture, and then the other cultures seem to be peripheral or marginal.
Well, the anchor culture actually stays within his shop, right?
Yeah.
Tenant in the mall does not control.
Yeah, it doesn't dominate. Yes,
Doesn't
yes, that's
dominate
right.
the second floor, the fifth floor, or the food court. The food court's none of its business, right?
Yeah.
So that happens. So it's a battle through democratic processes, which
Yes.
is a misuse of democracy in Malaysian case. You use democracy to fight for standardization of a federation that's doomed to fail. And if you push it further, something will break.
In a sense, it's this idea of the marginal actually being central to an entity. I mean, there's this idea that I was reading about where the marginal, peripheral is
what
central.
is the center? One thing I like about a city like London, for example, and certain others, to some extent even Singapore, you don't know where city center is. So I would use that analogy to why do you have, just because you have a concept America, you have a center? As in the case of America, you don't even have a center. Is it in the West, East, Texas, Florida? I don't know. Why do you need a center? It's this lazy conceptual thinking about power and economics that is kept going by the fact that we do not use intellectuals in government. We may use civil servants, educated, and so on, but we have that problem. And added on to that, I would say that now I might be to some extent exaggerating. I think with privatization, the 80s and 90s and so on, what it did to governance was that it bureaucratized it. It de-technocratized. So you had a fall in the technocratic proportion of the civil service, and you had a bureaucratizing of it, which to some extent just turns the bureaucracy. It is no longer a facilitator of development. It becomes a hindrance to development because it's largely bureaucratic and no longer has a purpose other than to itself. Yeah. No, I exaggerate, I'm sure. But there is that trend, and that trend cannot be allowed to grow. If we want Malaysia to actually be nimble on its feet, to be to be a global player, to be influential in many ways, yeah. In the end, it's economics, If your economy doesn't grow in relation to others, then you're in trouble. It can grow, but too slow compared to others, then your ringgit falls, and so that's the world we live in. So whichever way you want to see it, that is how you have to do it. You need a happy people, and a happy people is a free people, a people who feel that they can move, and they are not under pressure at basic levels, like what language I should speak. Should I be ashamed of this? Should I be ashamed of that? Do you have a people who feel at home? If you don't, and I'm including the Malays in this,
yes,
then you're not having a people who will, join hands, as you were, right? We have to have different centers. This is the nature of Malaysia itself. And in certain ways, you should facilitate as a central power, but you have to trust that all the parts are actually pulling in the same direction. That is the nature of Malaysia, I think, and this is the legacy of how the British ran the place, right? studying British colonialism in Southeast Asia, you could see that they were doing different things here. They were here over 150 years or so on. Penang and Singapore had different functions compared to the other parts. They didn't care all that much about Perak and so on until the supply of tin was affected. And then they had to go in and secure the supply of tin. So to use today's language, you have to secure the supply chain. And in order to secure the supply chain, they went in and took Perak. And then once they took that, they thought that's a good formula. Why not take the rest, right? And so you had
in other states.
You had the Federated Malay States, which had a certain function. They were not, it was indirect rule in that sense because of that was good enough for them. And then as they went along, other contingencies come along. So Johor had to play a different role because of its closeness to Singapore. And when other European powers became interested in the northern states, they signed a treaty with Siam and forced Siam to give control over to them. Only for a little while, and then the Japanese came and took that and gave them back to Siam. And then 1945, we took them back, so on and so forth, right? So, and then you have Sabah and Sarawak, totally different histories. And all of this we call Malaysia. And of course, it had to break. Brunei was smart enough not to join, right? And Singapore had to break out. So if you look at it, in the end, the final solution was of the British colonies, you ended up with 3 countries, right? You ended up with Brunei, Singapore, and Malaysia. And Malaysia is the where most of the parts are, and therefore the diversity is in that. And therein lies Malaysia's fate. And now if Malaysia is to show the world what a wonderful place it is, because of this unique legacy, if it makes itself work, if it can succeed as a multiracial country, that would be quite a lesson to the world.
Quite an achievement.
But we have to admit what we are first, and not try to describe ourselves as something else, and therefore act wrongly.
All right, that's what we have for this section of the conversation. We'll come back to discuss more fully on the topic of leadership.
Thank you, Fauwaz.
Thank you very much.